Who is this man? What was he doing in Montana? What was he trying to achieve? Why is he important to us now and forever? His name is Louis Riel. We asked a few folks in Helena what they know about him.
Nothing.
Nothing.
I don't know.
Sadly enough, I know nothing about Louis Riel.
Nothing.
That's a name I'm not familiar with.
I think he was the guy up in Canada who did something incredible with French settlers or Indians, something. I know he's a legend in Canada.
Louis Riel was a Métis Canadian man, and he fought for the rights of the Métis people in the Canadian West, and eventually he was arrested because he led rebellions against the government, and so eventually he was put on trial and then they hanged him.
Riel was a religious and political visionary leader who led 2 rebellions against Canada, primarily to secure land and political recognition for the Métis, the predominantly French-speaking progeny of voyageurs and Indians whose fur trading exploits led to wilderness marriages and who constituted, by the 1840s, the largest cohesive ethnic group west of the Mississippi.
Louis Riel is one of my favorite personalities in Montana's history, not just Canadian history. Some people have called him a dreamer, a fanatic, that he was stern, he was proud, he was a misguided leader. Some said he was the John Brown of the Métis people. Some said he was visionary, cultivated, kind of flighty, impulsive, vain, often arrogant, had a great religious ardor about him, and that he was quite mystical. So he's an interesting person. I thought of folks in terms of Montana's history that I'd like to have lunch with sometime. Louis would be one of my favorites.
In Canada, Louis Riel is a monumental and controversial character. In Montana, where he spent 5 seminal years in exile, Riel is barely known. In this short documentary, we aim to bring just this aspect of his life's journey out of the shadows of a seemingly hidden history. For independent scholar Nicholas Vrooman, Louis Riel is something of a magnificent obsession.
Louis Riel was born in Red River Settlement, which is now Winnipeg, in the 1840s, and he grew up, and as a young teenager was sent to Montreal to receive probably as sophisticated and high-toned an education as was available in all of North America at that time. Latin, Greek, mathematics, all of those classic subjects. And went back to Red River, 1869-70, led this resistance. It was the changeover from Hudson Bay Company controlling all of the central part of the continent, and Canada and the United States fighting for who was going to gain control over that land. The Aboriginal people, of which are included the Métis, were left out of those discussions. He led a resistance to at least have their voices heard. Out of that, he became a basically the first representative in the Canadian Parliament for the province of Manitoba. 1870, Manitoba coming into Canadian Confederation. But he was exiled at that time from Canada for some violence that occurred during the resistance. So actually from the early 1870s until 1879, he was in the United States for the most part, but the northeastern part of the nation, New England. But in 1879, he came to Montana. And he came to the Milk River area of Montana, northeastern Montana. There was a very significant Métis town and a broad-based Métis community along Milk River as it flows into the Missouri River up in that country. And indeed, Métis had been living and wintering and migrating with the buffalo within the fur trade economy from the early part of the 19th century, well, all the way up still into 1879. There were still buffalo in the wild, still being hunted. And he wanted to experience that buffalo lifestyle and be with his still the last, as it were, not only free-roaming buffalo, but free-roaming Aboriginal peoples.
Yeah.
And
whose way of life was geared toward the migration of these incredible animals.
In Cree, they called it Ochpemsook, which means they who own themselves. And in French, it's called gens libres, the free men. And in English, the free men. And it was the last of the era of the free men, which, I mean, literally out in the wild, living as you do. When he came to Montana in '79, he was, here again, I mean, here's this highly educated man who had been in the Northeast for almost a decade. And in the Northeast, he was there during 1876, which was the centennial of
the Republic.
Yeah. And the Northeast, New England, and that was during the flowering of New England when Transcendentalism, the James Brothers, Francis Parkman, Henry Thoreau, and I mean all
giants of our
Emerson, Walt Whitman, all those people are there at that time. And they're lecturing, and that was the cultural, that was pop culture, was all of those people and what they had to add to American identity at that time. And Riel was right there among all of that. And so he comes directly from the American centennial in the flowering of New England with all of that transcendental contextual background for American identity. To the buffalo camps of Montana. And what he was doing here was he understood coming out of the American Centennial that in the progressive revelation of human rights, with the independence of the United States sort of throwing off the shackles of monarchism, and talking about republicanism, small r, and democracy, and engendering the whole of the independence movements, that's still rippling around the world today. And go from that to the abolitionist movement and to the Emancipation Proclamation, and all of these, what were considered and talked about in 1876, that there was this not only what the flowering of New England was about and what transcendentalism was about in American culture was really that we were the place where the world came together in a new synthesis, and that we were about creating a new human community. And Riel really saturated himself in that and understood what occurred in 1869 and 70 back in Red River Settlement, Winnipeg, and the Métis resistance and fight for their local rights really belonged in a wider context of this broader human rights movement that the independence movements were all about. in 1879, everybody knew the buffalo were going to be gone in the next couple of years. And indeed, it was 82, 83 that
wiped out.
That was it. That was the end.
As a source of livelihood.
And all of a sudden, musical chairs, the music stopped. And that was it. And wherever you were at that time, when the music stopped, you were lucky to get a chair. And many people didn't get a chair. And the new project, the new mercantile agricultural society that was taking over from the old fur trade society. And all those people that were part of the old fur trade society who were still here, left without a chair, basically they ended up squatting where they could and settling in and making communities where they could. And that's really where, like, the Lewistown community began. 1879, 80, 81, 82. All of the new Anglos who are coming in after the Civil War and after the settling of the Dakotas, there was this constant westward push of immigration. And so by the 1880s, you really see all of these new towns starting to form around Montana, and these new Anglos, who are the Main Street merchants and the farmers, don't understand who the swarthy, dark-skinned
squatter people
are at the peripheries of these new towns. All they see is poor people who speak a strange language and have no particular job that they're there for, and they don't know the history of the place. They don't know what went on before because they just came from Norway. They just came from Germany. They don't know what the fur trade was and the role of these people in finessing as middlemen the whole of the fur trade economics that really was the basis of the gross national product for so many years, that funded the creation of the American nation.
Not counting Nicholas and a few other scholars immersed in the epic story of the Canadian-American borderlands in the West, what little we Montanans might know about Riel is likely to be limited to road signs, or, just maybe, recollections of a fanciful movie about the Mounties, with Helena-born Gary Cooper as a Texas Ranger named Dusty Rhodes.
Canadian Northwest. Here the first traders from the Old World intermarried with the Indians of the plains and the forests to found a new race, the Métis of Canada. Here for 2 centuries, these half-breed hunters and trappers multiplied and prospered, a law unto themselves. Then surveyors and home builders pushed westward, bringing laws of land and property, which threatened to end forever the free ways of the wild trails. In 1885, resentful and confused, the half-breeds, under the leadership of Louis Riel, revolted against the advance of unwelcome law. In that hour, a handful of hard-riding men in scarlet coats, the Northwest Mounted Police, stood between Canada's destiny and the rebellion that was being kindled across the American border in a little Montana schoolhouse.
This was Cecil B. DeMille's first Technicolor extravaganza, and he got a whole lot of things about Riel and the Métis wrong, wrong, wrong. A much more authentic source of knowledge and insight about Riel is a book by Joseph Kinsey Howard entitled Strange Empire. Howard chronicles Riel's whole life in this remarkable history, which is one of the few works about Riel not written by Canadian scholars. Of course, it is contemporary Métis themselves who are well-schooled in their ancestral history, and they preserve what is essentially an oral culture by getting together and sharing stories, memories, and music. We talked with a few of these folks in 2009 at the annual Métis gathering in Lewistown.
I would like to tell you a little bit about our history. We are of the Métis culture, and a lot of people don't know or understand what a Métis is. A Métis is a person who is Native American, and could be in French mostly. And our languages are mixed with our different cultures. And our people were the backbone of this nation. The people from the old country, the French, the Scotch, the Irish, they came over to our country and first landing mostly in Nova Scotia, where our relatives lived and landed. And they came farther into Quebec, and the first grandpa he moved to Quebec, and he married a Native American lady. And from there they raised their families, and there are a lot of people in our country now that are Métis, but very few people know who the Métis are or anything about them. To this day, a lot of people come up to me and say, well, what is a Métis? Well, a Métis is a person. I have to explain that there are people that are of mixed blood, you know, from different areas, mostly from France, and a lot of Scotch and a lot of Irish, you know, mixture in our heritage. So once in a while they say, well, what do you speak? Well, I tell them, well, it really sounds strange to a lot of people, because a lot of our words are French, and a lot are Cree. We have Chippewa words in it, and Scotch.
My name's Alfred Moran. I was born in 1928 during the Depression, and things were really hard in those days. And most of the way we lived, we had to hunt and snare rabbits and pick berries and roots and just food off the land, you know.
I am Métis myself, and I try to keep up on the traditional ways. My wife, Elaine, is also Métis, and we try to keep up on the traditional foods, cooking traditional foods, and trying to keep it passed down to our friends and relatives, and even strangers. There's a whole lot of people does not know who we are, or that we even exist. Like I say, I'm from Choteau, Montana, and I work very closely with Nature Conservancy, and they have guests in from all over the world. And I give a lot of programs up there to their guests over time, and they are so happy to hear about the story, and because they just don't know anything about it. And what I found over the years here is people is really interested in the Indian history, and especially the Métis history. I guess kind of the way I look at it, in a way, that people is kind of fed up with fiction material, and they're leaning back more to the real stories. I know quite a bit about Louis Riel, and both of my wife and I, there's not a lot of people can say this, but we can. When Louis Riel came out of Canada and came into North Dakota, as Rose said, and he drifted into Montana, different places in Montana. Of course, at that time it wasn't Montana, it was a territorial country, same as Dakota. And he just kind of drifted around the territorial country, and he even went down as low as, well, I guess I don't know if you'd really call it low, but he went and tried his hand at herding sheep. And that didn't work out for him, because Louis Riel was kind of a dreamer, a thinker,
and so on, such as that. And there, I guess there's many other words for it too. And unfortunately, he lost his job of herding sheep because he forgot what he was doing with his flock. As far as Louis Riel, in people's eyes to this day, Indian or non-Indian, it doesn't make any difference. He is still respected and he's still looked upon as a great man and a great leader.
Each year, at the International Peace Garden that straddles the boundary between North Dakota and the province of Manitoba, members of this far-flung cultural nation come together in a joyous celebration known as Métis Fest.
Hey, we came here from the north, they're coming from the south.
And it remains a huge symbol of the Métis people. The Plains Indian sign language across the plains, all the groups, their sign for a Métis was cart and man. And it's my belief that from the sign for a cart, which is the two wheels, comes the infinity sign on the Métis national flag.
I was born and raised in a small Métis community of St. Lazare, Manitoba, Canada. And I was raised by a very traditional Michif family. And I learned all the cultural, traditional language components. And we never talked about it, we lived who we were. Like we didn't have to go and tell people who we were and to have some type of a significance, which meant what Michif was, because I grew up in that era. And I was fortunate that my grandparents were people that really expressed themselves in their culture. And that was with language, and that was with their social activities and their way of life. We lived on a small scale farm. We were basically people that were subsistence farmers. And we lived off the land also. It was a mixed cultural component of a lifestyle. We had, very few, but a few head of cattle, a few horses. We raised chickens, we raised hogs, and we had big gardens. We trapped, we fished, we harvested, and we were berry pickers, and we preserved, conserved, and did all those things. It was sort of a amalgamation of the whole works to make up a rich culture, because since we're the best of both worlds, of European and First Nation ancestral blood that runs in our veins, and then we all, it's safe to say a fifth generation Michif person, and to become and recognized as a distinct nation, or you have to have those something that's distinct about you, and my language well, my mom's 107 years old and she speaks Michif. Her parents spoke Michif, her grandparents spoke Michif, and there was no intermarriages other than it was Michif for 5 generations. The Englishmen will call us half-breed, or the Irish or the Scottish or whomever, and the Frenchman will say Métis, but we are the Michif. And now they'll use the term Métis, but that's more of a political term. Michif is actually our nationality. My mom, that's 107 years old, if you ask her, what's your nationality, she'd say, En Michifnia. I'm Michif Bikshkwan. I'm a Michif and I speak Michif. And sometimes they'd say, Cree Bikshkwan, like I speak Cree. Mais c'est pas le vrai Cree, it's not the real Cree. Le français d'Abatstan. Ma langue, she said. And that's what makes you the uniqueness of being a Michif.
During Riel's 5-year sojourn in Montana Territory, He worked as a buffalo hunter, a trader, a woodcutter, and an interpreter, spokesman, translator of sorts in the north-central reaches near Spring Creek, now Lewistown. In 1880, he wintered on the Milk River and lobbied the territorial government, unsuccessfully, for the establishment of a Métis reservation in southeast Montana.
Louis Riel came up with this idea of having a single reservation down in southeast Montana. So he actually approached Colonel Nelson Miles at Fort Keogh, present-day Miles City, wanted to get federal dollars for seeds, for grain, for implements, and to create a large reservation. And then his role would be to bring the recalcitrant other tribes all together into a massive reservation. Well, Miles couldn't negotiate something like that. That would have been a national treaty, and it would have completely muddled up the clash of civilizations, white and Indian.
In 1881, Riel met 20-year-old Marguerite Belhumeur, fell in love, and got married. In the 2 subsequent years, the couple had 2 children. Louis was hired to teach at a small school at St. Peter's Mission, the foremost Jesuit outpost in the region and a very special place in this part of North America.
It's an amazing place. It really is sacred geography from within Aboriginal perspectives on what this specific piece of land represents. Really, up until 150 years ago, this place was generally recognized by Aboriginal people throughout the continent as really the compass rose or the crossroads of the north-south, east-west axis of the northern part of the backbone of the world. Right here at the Birdtail, and the name Birdtail is an Aboriginal name for this territory, for this rock outcropping here, was a widespread, well-known place in the Aboriginal mind throughout the region. And right here, if you continue west from here on the road, you cross over to the Dearborn, where the Dearborn flows out of the Continental Divide. Right at that place, there's a whole string of passes that really, Cadot's Pass, Lewis and Clark Pass, Mullen Pass, Priest Pass, McDonald, up and down this section. It was the road to the Buffalo for the people, the Salish people living on the west side of the Continental Divide, and for the people living on the east side of the Continental Divide, you go over the hump here at the divide, and you're at the Blackfoot River at Lincoln. And you follow that down to Bonner, and you're at the Clark Fork, and you follow that to Spokane, you're at the Columbia, and then you're at the Pacific Coast. And then you turn around and you look east, right here, there's the Missouri River. And you just walk up the trail directly from here, past the Buffalo Jump at Ulm, and you're up the river at the Marias and Fort Benton and that territory, and you're on the High Line, and the Missouri takes you right to the confluence of the Yellowstone, the Big Bend of the Missouri, and you either cut south at that point to pick up the Mississippi at St. Louis and the Gulf of Mexico, or right at the Big Bend where the Mandan Hidatsa villages are, which is really the geographical center of the continent, you continue a day's walk and you're at the Red River, and at Red River, at Pembina, is the road to the War Road, they called it, or through Rainy River, over to Lake Superior and through the Great Lakes and to the St. Lawrence River, and you're at the Atlantic. Or you go north. So this whole territory really was this continental interchange, the superhighway continental interchange for Aboriginal people, and had been for 10,000 years. We know that there's, through archaeological evidence, that this place has continual, not constant, but continual human habitation for at least 10,000 years right here at the Birdtail. 1879, 80, 81, there was a major pogrom by the U.S. government, the Army, to clear the border of any any riffraff, I'll say. And so it was at that time that there was a major mixed blood settlement up on the big bend of the Milk River at Frenchman's Creek. And it used to be a wintering camp, but then it became a full-time trade town. But that was cleared out, and numbers of those folks either went back to the Turtle Mountains, or they went up to Saskatoon, or a significant contingent of them came down to the Judith Basin and created Spring Creek, which has become Lewistown, and that was the beginning of the Métis settling in the Judith Basin area. Well, this place was already here, and there were priests already here. So the folks, when they came down off the Milk River, and Louis Riel was among them over in the Judith, and they knew that this was where there was pre-existing mixed blood communities. And it wasn't just right here at St. Peter's, but also at the Dearborn. There was a colony on the Dearborn back up into the mountains. There was another colony at Choteau back up in the South Fork of the Teton, another at Depouillier. So in all of these, coulees and breaks areas and canyons going back into the Front Range, there were numerous Métis colonies or settlements up and down the Front Range that were already here before those who came down from the Milk River, whom Louis Riel was part of. In 1882-83, all of a sudden the buffalo disappeared. And everybody knew that they had to find a sedentary existence, that the roaming days were over. And this was a viable place. And they had the resources and the help of the Catholic Church to maintain a viable community here and to have an occupation as an educator. And education was valued amongst the Métis. The Métis were half in the Euro-American world as well as half in the Aboriginal world. And they really considered themselves as having the best of both worlds. And so education was important, and reading and writing and arithmetic and religious studies and geography and all of those things. Participating in the society was something that they wished to happen. And his entreaties to the government in trying to bring the mixed bloods into the fold, as it were, was all about, we want to be good citizens. We want farms. We want the knowledge, skills, and abilities of how to engage the American society successfully. So being an educator was something that he valued, as well as being here. I mean, he was a very religious man also, and so this fulfilled that bill for him too. When you walk into this place, I mean, I'm overwhelmed by it, because where else in America today can you walk into the 19th century? I mean, you walk through that door and you're in the 19th century here. And how the local community has maintained this place in situ, in context here. For all that's been lost through the fires and the deterioration of the other outbuildings and stuff, or the whole colony that used to be here, at least this place is still here. This is one of the oldest buildings in Montana. That specter, for me, remains. Walking into this church, being able to feel not only him kneeling at the altar right here, but his family and all of the other people who committed their lives to this piece of land here and knew the story and brought forward a sense of wanting to engage America in a new way and be part of this larger project that is the United States. And they were very, very hopeful at that time. And he really believed, and he wrote about it when he was here, that the next increment in human rights, what happened to the slaves and the blacks, the Indians and the Métis were next in line to fully be incorporated within this new democracy, this new incredible idea in human experience that America represented. And he wrote about that. And this community lived with that kind of hope, because they listened to him talk about this stuff right here in these pews.
On a fateful spring day in 1884, Gabriel Dumont and 3 fellow Métis from the Saskatchewan River area of Canada's Northwest Territories arrived at St. Peter's Mission. They'd traveled 700 miles to summon Riel to lead the Métis once more in rebellion against the encroachments of English Canada. Riel prayed on the matter and quickly assented. He believed that he was the divinely selected leader of the Métis and the prophet of a new form of Christianity. The 1885 Northwest Rebellion failed. The military forces that Canada brought to bear against the Métis were far superior, thanks in part to material support from the United States. Louis Riel remains a deeply divisive figure. Many Canadian historians have branded him as a megalomaniac, as well as a traitor. To the Métis on both sides of the 49th parallel, and to many French Canadians as well, Riel continues to be venerated as both a political and cultural hero.
And they did talk about Louis Riel, but they talked about Louis Riel in really, really high honor and really high regards. They seen him as a spiritual person because he had been involved with the church so much, and he was going to become a priest, or he was going to Montreal to get educated and to become a priest. But not only that, he always referred, he wasn't a warrior, he was more of a leader, a spiritual leader. So they seen that, and they were so involved in the Catholicism and beliefs that they seen this person, as we seen priests years ago, they represented God, they represented Jesus. And Louis Riel was one of those spiritual leaders. He was a leader of not only a leader of the people, but he was also a spiritual leader. As we know and we hear and we read about and we hear from other elders from around Duck Lake and those places, that he carried a crucifix while others were carrying guns and protecting themselves. He walked along the trenches and he'd walk around the battleground with his crucifix, and he was praying that God would help. So that's why they seen him. So when he went to the gallows, my grandmother said it wasn't really, it was a vision of him that was being hung. It wasn't really him, that he lived on. Louis Riel lived on. That's why he lives here today yet, amongst in this rendezvous. And wherever you go, you hear Louis Riel, and he's still with us.
Riel's sojourn in Montana cannot be separated from the fate of his people, the mixed-race Métis. Charlie Russell was a friend to the Métis. This celebrated Western artist was often seen wearing a Métis sash, perhaps the most visible emblem of this Euro-Aboriginal culture.
The Métis people tie in with the Chippewa Cree, the Assiniboine, the Blackfeet. A lot of people have made up the Indian confederations in the 1870s. A lot of them settled in the Big Bend of the Missouri country around, if you think of Fort Benton east. Settlements over the years were in Helena, in the Sun River area around Fort Benton, around the Milk River, and around the Spring Creek area around Lewistown. And the border was very, very fluid. When we think of Homeland Security today, there was no such animal as that. The Northwest Mounted Police and the few marshals and sheriffs out in Montana had little control over a border that was very, very fluid. And the few military posts that were out here meant that Indians crossed back and forth all the time.
The Métis are such interesting people. I mean, like I said, they were so well organized. And you probably know that Red River cart was amazing. Yeah. It was solid wood. That meant the wheel and the axle, everything was wood. And you could hear those things for miles.
I guess they screeched.
Yeah, and you couldn't put grease on it because the dirt would get in the grease. And so anytime anything went wrong, you just cut a tree down, you know? And they were just unbelievable. And anytime they'd move their group, they'd stop and they'd set up their tents, and they'd have wooden floors for them, and immediately would have their dances and all. So they had quite their society.
The Métis controlled the transportation system. Their invention of the Red River cart commercialized the buffalo hunt. Prior to that, people were restricted to the rivers with their canoes or boats. They couldn't leave the river system. With the invention of the Red River Cart, which happened about 65, 70 miles east of here at Pembina, at Alexander Henry the Younger's post in 1801, his Métis employees created the carts, and it remains a huge symbol of the Métis people.
Well, some argue that Louis Riel was tried for treason for something he shouldn't have been tried for because he was an American citizen when he was tried at Regina in Saskatchewan. What had happened is that when the Northwest Rebellion failed in 1885, that Riel was brought to trial. Every member of the jury, 6 members, were all Anglo Protestants. Here he was, French background, Métis Indian by background. So was he tried by his own peers? Well, he was tried for leading insurrection against the Queen, Victoria. Well, they found him insane. Oh no, wait a minute, I'm not insane. I won't go along with that. He had leading attorneys helping his cause. Well, it turned out that it captured the public fancy of everybody in Canada, so they followed it very, very closely. The jury said that he should be tried and imprisoned. As it turned out, the judge said no, he should be hung for treason. So, he dies.
The execution of Louis Riel remains a contentious matter in Canadian jurisprudence. There can be little question that the circumstances of Louis Riel's trial were immoral, wrote Kinsey Howard. Whether the trial itself was also illegal has been debated ever since it was held. It's worth noting that there are ongoing efforts to have Riel officially exonerated by the Canadian government. Notwithstanding a confusion of identities and the obscurities of a largely hidden history, Riel continues to embody Métis identity and inspire pride and confidence in the Métis culture. Whether Riel was ahead or hopelessly behind his time is part of the enduring mystery of this enigmatic leader. For some of the Métis themselves, Riel never really died. Louis Riel is an extraordinarily prismatic personality, reflecting all of the most important elements of the Western prairies: the fur trade, the buffalo hunt, the coming of the railroad, the pacification of the Indians, the establishment of settled communities and jurisdictions, and the parallel expansion of 2 separate, yet forever entwined Wests, Canadian and American.
The 49th parallel, the medicine line, is their traditional historic homeland bridges the medicine line. And it's like musical chairs. When all of a sudden the music stopped in the reconfiguration, and whoever was left where you were when the music stopped, that's what you became. You became Canadian, you became Montanan or North Dakotan, but really it's all the same people. I mean, I've got Norwegian relatives in Canada, but we're the same family. And the Crees and the mixed bloods up there are the same Crees and mixed bloods down here on Rocky Boy or the Little Shell or, you know, or whomever. And that dividing line still was not, even though they understood the politics of it back in 1884, 1885, they still understood themselves to be one people.
In this short program, we've barely scratched the surface of Louis Riel's life and times. His story crosses and recrosses many borders. His vision transcends history. The spirit of Louis Riel is alive and well. We can experience it through literature, scholarship, conversation, and most of all, the festive gatherings of Métis people.
Our new race was created, our new nation rose up strong. Hardship as its destiny, and it's cursed to not belong. In the land from which they came, in the land they helped to build, they found themselves the alien, found their vision unfulfilled. And despite their valiant effort to defend what they believe, when at last the battle ended, they were only left to grieve. We are proud to be Métis, watch a nation rise again. Never more forgotten people, we're the true Canadians.